I was on my way home when I noticed this random string trimmer on the edge of the road, so I turned around, parked at a nearby business and picked it up, put it in the car and drove the rest of the way home. I didn't even look to see what brand it was, but if I had, I think I would have put it back where I found it. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this hyper tough string trimmer, and the problem is that I quite literally found this on the side of the road on a busy street, and of course I don't know if it runs. Now when I picked it up, I was more concerned about being hit by a passing car than looking at what brand it was. I knew it felt cheap when I grabbed it, but this has to be one of the cheapest trimmers on the market right now. I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, however it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. The first thing I want to do is look it over and see if it's been damaged from its time in the roadway. If I had to guess, either someone threw it out of a moving vehicle or it fell off the back of a truck. Either way, it's definitely got a few bumps and scratches. But there is one part that looks the worst, and that's the shaft near the trimmer head. You can see that the shaft is bent from the impact. Now, I don't know if this will hurt its performance, however, it wasn't the only thing that was damaged from its fall. Now, the gearbox is now loose, so hopefully it still works, but we won't know that until we get it started and running. As you can see by the information sticker, this trimmer is only a few years old. This is also when we notice that one of the fuel tank's mounting tabs has come out of its location, so we'll have to fix that as well. Since this trimmer had some fuel in the tank, the next thing I want to do is prime the fuel system and try and start it. However, I noticed that the primer bulb doesn't sound like it should, which is never a good sign. Now the bulb does have fuel in it, so that means the carb should have fuel in it as well. Fortunately, it started and ran for a bit, but it didn't stay running for very long. I'm going to try that again and maybe we'll get lucky. Well, we got it to run in the choke position, but after moving the lever to the second position, it didn't want to start again. Since it's having issues running at half choke, I'm going to try and adjust the carb to deliver more fuel to the engine. For that, I'm going to need a special screwdriver. If you'd like to buy a set of these special tools, you can find a link in the description. For this particular carb, I need to use the Pac-Man screwdriver to be able to turn the screws. Normally, I would only adjust the screws when it's running, but since we can't do that, I'm just going to guess what adjustments need to be made. I don't like doing it this way, but I really don't have a choice. Now, on this carburetor, the adjustment screws are right on top, which makes filming really easy. The screw closer to the air filter is the H screw, and it's for adjusting fuel delivery at full throttle or when the trigger is fully squeezed. That means the screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for adjusting fuel delivery at idle speeds and when you're squeezing the trigger to go to full speed. Now, by the way the engine is acting, I'm going to increase the fuel that's being delivered to the engine, and just for consistency, I'm going to turn both screws counterclockwise about a quarter turn to begin with. So unfortunately, the engine didn't even try and start. That means we need to do a further inspection of the fuel system, starting what's inside the fuel tank. If the fuel was several months old or has contaminants in it like water, that would definitely keep the engine from starting. However, after pouring it out, I don't see any water in the fuel, nor does it smell stale, so I don't think that's our problem. If you're not sure if the fuel is stale, try mixing up a fresh batch and then try starting the engine again. Now, the most likely reason for the engine to not start or stay running is a carb issue. That means we need to remove it from the engine so we can inspect it. The first part I'm going to remove is the pumping side. If you recall, when I was pressing the bulb, I said it sounded kind of strange. Now, after removing the bulb, you can see the red check valve, but what's odd to me is that it's not centered but slightly offset. It's also loose, which it's not supposed to be. I think there might be a problem with it, but we'll take a closer look here in a little bit. After taking off the pumping side, you can see the inlet screen, which could get clogged with debris from the tank. However, as you can see, the screen is mostly clear with only a tiny amount of debris on it, which is not enough to stop fuel from flowing through the carb. So this is not the reason why this engine won't start. While I'm here, I'm also going to check that the two check valve flaps are flat and parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. Now the easiest way to check is to look at it from the side. If either of the flaps is sticking up or down, then you might have to buy a rebuild kit. Now this one looks good, so we're going to reuse it. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the metal plate covering the metering diaphragm, and what we're looking for is whether or not it's beginning to harden up, or if it has wrinkles in it. Now the metering diaphragm has to be soft and pliable for it to control the fuel flow through the carb. So the metering diaphragm is still very pliable, which is kind of interesting since we couldn't get the engine to start, but what I also see is that there are wrinkles in it which could hamper its movement. The other thing that I noticed is that the diaphragm is kind of crooked, which it's not supposed to be. This might also affect the way it controls fuel flow through the carb. That means we need to remove it and replace it. Now, when replacing these diaphragms, the most important part is that your new one needs to have the same length stem in the middle as the old one. There are typically two different sizes, either a short or a long stem. For this one, it looks to be the short stem. So our first issue is that I don't have the exact diaphragm that we need, but I do have one that's really close. The original one has 4 screw holes and 1 smaller locating hole, while the one I have only has 3 screw holes and 1 smaller locating hole. I don't think having 1 less screw hole is going to matter, just so long as the stem is the same, which it is. Now, before we replace the diaphragm, we need to check to make sure that fuel will flow through the inlet screen. After putting some fuel in the pocket where the screen is located, I'll then press the rocker arm on the opposite side and check to see if the fuel disappears in the pocket. Unfortunately, the fuel is not passing through the screen. That means we need to remove the needle and rocker arm assembly. That way we can safely clean any varnish that might be on the screen. If this doesn't work, we'll need to remove the screen. That way we can let it soak in some carb cleaner for a while. Now the gasket for the metering diaphragm is in the way of the needle, so I'm going to carefully get it out of the way. You don't need to completely remove the gasket, just loosen it, and that should be enough clearance for the needle to pass by it. After the needle is out of the way, we can now safely spray some carb cleaner on the screen and then agitate it. If this works, the carb cleaner will then disappear through the screen as well, but unfortunately it's not doing that either. That means we need to carefully remove the screen for a better cleaning. I'll then put it into a cap with some carb cleaner in it and let it soak for a while. Every now and then I'll stir it a bit, but that may not be needed. Now this process could take several minutes and you might have to replace the carb cleaner that evaporates. While I'm waiting, I'm going to check to make sure that the fuel passage behind the screen is also clear, and luckily it is. If yours isn't, you might want to push a small wire through it. After 10 minutes of soaking, I'm going to replace the screen and then put some fuel on it to see if it'll pass through it, and luckily this time the fuel is passing through it. That means we can now replace the metering diaphragm and put the rest of the carb back together. If you don't want to go through all these steps to clean and service a carb, you could always buy a new one. I almost forgot, we need to remove that check valve under the bulb and see what's wrong with it. Now I don't know what happened here, but the valve seems to be torn. I've never seen anything like this before, so I can only imagine this happened from the factory. I'll just replace it with one from a bad carb, and it should work just like it's supposed to after that. Now, when replacing all the smaller parts, just be very careful because they are very easy to lose, and yes, I have dropped plenty of small parts in the grass. When that happens, I'll then use a magnet to find the parts in the grass, but sometimes I don't find them. The spot where I'm working has very short grass, that way it makes it a lot easier to find the parts if I do drop them. Once the rocker assembly is back on, try pressing it to make sure that it's moving like it's supposed to. After that, we can then replace the metering diaphragm and the metal plate over it. In most cases, the plate can be installed in any direction. However, I have seen a few that only went on one way, but I haven't seen one in a long time. Once the metal plate is back on, we can then put the pumping side back onto the carb. Now, while editing this video, I just realized that I did not replace the bulb. Now, my thinking was that it was only a couple years old and it wasn't even discolored yet, so it should still be good for several more years. Besides, this one is really easy to replace even while on the engine. Now, before we put the carb back on the engine, I'm going to replace the fuel lines, and since we need to put the tank back into the correct location, I'm going to remove it and put the lines on while it's off the trimmer. The first step is to take off the old lines, filter, and any splices that might be on the lines. The fuel line I'll be using is 3/16 of an inch Tygon line because it's supposed to be more ethanol resistant. I can't guarantee that it won't fail, but it should last longer than if we used clear line. It is a little bit more expensive, but you won't have to change the lines as often, so in my book, it's worth the money. After cutting the line at an angle to get it into the hole in the tank, I'll then pull the end out of the tank. That way we can cut the angle piece off and install the fuel filter. Now you must run a fuel filter because if you don't, that inlet screen that we cleared off earlier will clog up and keep the engine from starting and running. After putting the filter back into the tank, we can then use the same method to install the return line. The only difference is that I'm going to install the plastic splice that came out of the tank. Its job will be to keep the return line from coming out of the tank. You don't have to install it, but since it came with it, I'm going to replace it. And once you're done, it should look like this when everything is installed. The last thing we need to do is cut the fuel line close to the location where the fuel line will be, reinstall the tank, followed by the carburetor. We should then be ready to try and start the engine and make any fuel adjustments as needed. Now, when installing the carb to the engine, the fuel line with the filter will attach to the port closer to the bottom of the carb, which means that the return line will then connect to the port near the bulb. But before installing the carb to the engine, I'm going to put some fuel into the tank so we can see if the fuel will flow through the lines like they're supposed to. This will also confirm that we've attached the lines correctly. So when pressing the bulb, fuel should flow through the filter line, out of the tank and into the carb. It will then fill the bulb and then leave the carb through the return line and back to the tank. As you can see, the fuel is flowing through the lines just like they're supposed to. If yours does not flow like this but comes out of the tank through the return line first, then your lines might be swapped at the carb. However, if fuel comes up from the tank but it won't make it all the way to the carb, then there might be an issue inside the carb and will need to be inspected again. Now, there is supposed to be a foam air filter, but I'll order one once I know it runs. If you recall, I turned both screws counterclockwise earlier to try and deliver more fuel to the engine. I'm going to leave it at that setting for right now and see what happens. The good news is that it started and ran for almost 15 seconds, but then it stopped. That means I'm going to turn the L screw counterclockwise again, another quarter turn, to see if it'll stay running long enough for us to make our final adjustments. Luckily, it stayed running after adding more fuel at idle. Now, what happened after that was I was trying to set the H screw about a quarter turn past the point where the engine was running the fastest. The extra fuel will keep the engine from running at max speed, but it will run cooler and last longer in this setting. So another option as to why this trimmer wouldn't stay running is that the engine might be worn out because it was running on fuel that didn't have enough oil in it. Now, this would cause premature wear on the piston ring and the engine would have less compression than it's supposed to, leading to running issues. The fix for this would be to rebuild the top end. So this is when reality set in. With filming, the repair took 2 hours and I put about $7 in parts into it, but I'm not sure if it's worth it. The reason is I can buy the same model from my local Mega Mart store for only $68. So my question is, was this repair worth it? Now keep in mind, I haven't replaced the air filter yet, so the cost might go up a few more dollars. Maybe I should have just left it on the side of the road where I found it. Personally, I don't really know, but after realizing how cheap a new replacement trimmer is, I almost wish I could go back in time and never picked it up. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.